What happens when America's beloved country star goes head-to-head with one of morning television's most controversial hosts? You won't believe what unfolds when Blake Shelton sits down for what should have been a light-hearted chat about his latest album, only to find himself trapped in a verbal battlefield that would leave viewers absolutely stunned. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and by the end of this explosive encounter, one of country music's biggest names would storm off set in a fury that had the entire studio audience gasping in disbelief. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerful personalities clash in the most dramatic showdown morning television has seen in years. The stage was set for disaster from the moment Blake Shelton walked onto the Today Show set. What started as promotional appearances for his new music quickly transformed into a battleground of egos, accusations, and heated exchanges that would have fans picking sides for weeks to come. This is the shocking true account of how a simple morning show appearance became the most talked-about television moment of the year. The morning started innocently enough, with Blake Shelton arriving at the NBC studios in his signature laid-back style, ready to discuss his latest musical ventures and upcoming tour dates. The country superstar, known for his quick wit and charm, seemed genuinely excited to be back on national television, greeting crew members with his trademark Oklahoma friendliness. He'd been on countless talk shows throughout his career, from late-night comedy to morning news programs, and never once had there been any indication that this appearance would be any different from the dozens of others he'd done over the years. Jenna Hager, however, had apparently prepared a very different kind of interview than what Blake was expecting. Sources backstage revealed that she had been researching not just his music, but diving deep into some of the more controversial aspects of his personal life and career choices. The production team had noticed her unusually intense preparation, with multiple researchers providing her with talking points that went far beyond the typical promotional material that accompanies most celebrity appearances on morning television. As Blake settled into the familiar orange couch, adjusting his cowboy hat and flashing that million-dollar smile that had won over millions of fans, the atmosphere in the studio felt electric, with an undercurrent of tension that only those closest to the production could sense. The audience, packed with devoted fans who had arrived hours early hoping to catch a glimpse of their favorite country star, was buzzing with excitement, completely unaware that they were about to witness television history in the making. Jenna's opening remarks seemed standard enough, welcoming Blake back to the show and mentioning his impressive career achievements and his role as a coach on The Voice. But those who knew her interviewing style could detect something different in her tone, a slight edge that suggested she had more than just friendly conversation on her agenda. Her smile seemed forced, her posture more rigid than usual, and there was an intensity in her eyes that hinted at the confrontation that was brewing just beneath the surface. The first few minutes proceeded normally, with Blake discussing his latest album and sharing some lighthearted stories from the recording studio. His natural charisma was on full display as he recounted funny anecdotes about working with other artists and the creative process behind his newest songs. The audience was eating it up, laughing at his jokes and hanging on every word, while Jenna nodded along with what appeared to be genuine interest and enthusiasm. But then, without warning, the tone shifted dramatically. Jenna's expression grew serious as she leaned forward, her voice taking on a more interrogative quality that immediately put Blake on alert. "Blake, I want to talk about something that's been making headlines recently," she began, her words cutting through the previously relaxed atmosphere like a sharp blade. "There's been quite a bit of controversy surrounding some of your past comments about diversity in country music, and I think our viewers deserve to hear your response to the criticism you've been facing." Blake's smile faltered for just a moment, caught off guard by the sudden shift from promotional interview to what felt more like a cross-examination. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his easygoing demeanor replaced by visible confusion and growing irritation. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you referring to?" he asked, his voice maintaining its polite tone but with an underlying tension that hadn't been there moments before. Jenna pressed on, clearly prepared for this exact response. Well, there have been several instances where fans and fellow artists have called out what they perceive as your reluctance to fully embrace the changing face of country music. Some have suggested that your influence in the industry, particularly your role on The Voice, has been used to maintain certain traditional standards that some view as exclusionary. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Blake's jaw tightened visibly, and his hands, which had been casually resting on his knees, now gripped the arms of his chair. The easy smile that had charmed audiences for decades was nowhere to be found, replaced by a look of barely contained frustration and disbelief. "Jenna, I have to say I'm pretty surprised by this line of questioning," Blake replied, his voice still controlled but with an edge that everyone in the studio could hear. "I came here to talk about my music, my tour, and to have a good time with the folks watching at home. I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I think you might have some bad information." But Jenna wasn't backing down. If anything, Blake's defensive response seemed to energize her, as if she had been waiting for exactly this kind of reaction. "I don't think it's bad information, Blake. I think it's important for public figures like yourself to address these concerns when they arise. Your platform gives you tremendous influence, and with that comes responsibility." The studio audience, sensing the growing tension, had fallen completely silent. What had started as a fun morning show appearance was rapidly transforming into something much more serious and uncomfortable. Camera operators were adjusting their positions to capture every nuance of the increasingly heated exchange, while producers in the control room were undoubtedly debating whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation play out on live television. Blake took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure in the face of what he perceived as an ambush. "Look, I've spent my entire career supporting artists of all backgrounds. I've mentored singers from every walk of life on The Voice, and I've always believed that good music is good music, regardless of who's making it. I don't know what agenda you're trying to push here, but I'm not going to sit here and let you paint me as something I'm not." The word agenda seemed to strike a nerve with Jenna, and her professional mask began to slip slightly. "This isn't about an agenda, Blake. This is about accountability. When you have the platform that you have, people are going to hold you to a higher standard. And frankly, some of your recent choices have raised questions about whether you're truly committed to the evolution of country music or if you're trying to keep it stuck in the past." What had begun as pointed questioning was now evolving into something much more personal and accusatory, and both Blake and the audience could sense that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The tension in the studio was suffocating, with crew members exchanging worried glances as they watched their beloved morning show transform into something unrecognizable. Blake's face had gone from confused to angry, his Oklahoma drawl becoming more pronounced as his frustration mounted. "You know what, Jenna? I think I see what's happening here. You invited me on your show under false pretenses. I thought I was coming here as a friend to talk about music, but instead you've got me sitting here defending myself against accusations that frankly don't have any basis in reality." Jenna's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like satisfaction at having gotten under his skin. She leaned back in her chair with a slight smirk, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment throughout the entire interview. "False pretenses? Blake, this is journalism. This is what happens when public figures are asked to account for their actions and their influence. Maybe you're just not used to being challenged." The word challenged hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Blake's reaction was immediate and visceral. His hands clenched into fists on his lap, and his voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level that somehow seemed more threatening than if he had been shouting. "Not used to being challenged? Lady, I've been in this business for over 2 decades. I've faced criticism, I've dealt with controversy, and I've always handled it with grace and professionalism. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's a hit job." The studio audience was completely silent now, their excitement from earlier replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. Some viewers in the front row were shifting nervously in their seats, clearly unsure whether they should be watching this unfold or looking away out of respect for what was becoming an increasingly personal and ugly confrontation. Jenna, however, seemed to be feeding off the energy of the moment. Her posture had straightened, and there was an intensity in her voice that suggested she was just getting started. A hit job? Blake, asking you to explain your public statements and actions isn't a hit job. It's holding you accountable. And if you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye. Those words hit Blake like a physical blow. His face reddened visibly, and for a moment it looked like he might actually get up and leave right then and there. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned forward, matching Jenna's aggressive posture with his own. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about the accountability of a journalist who ambushes her guests with loaded questions and false narratives. Let's talk about the responsibility you have to your viewers to conduct fair and honest interviews instead of whatever this is. The personal nature of the attacks was escalating rapidly, with both participants now abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy. Jenna's voice rose slightly, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. False narratives? Blake, everything I've brought up today is based on documented statements and actions. If you don't like having your own words thrown back at you, maybe you should think more carefully about what you say in public. Blake's laugh was bitter and humorless. My own words? You mean the words you've taken out of context and twisted to fit whatever story you've decided to tell about me? This is exactly what's wrong with media today. You don't report the news anymore, you create it. And apparently, I'm your target du jour. The accusation of media manipulation seemed to strike a particularly sensitive nerve with Jenna, and her professional mask slipped even further. Her voice became sharp and defensive, with an edge that cut through the studio like a knife. Don't you dare lecture me about journalism, Blake. I've been doing this job with integrity and honesty long before you decided to grace us with your presence. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you should stick to singing songs about trucks and beer. The dismissive comment about his music was the spark that finally ignited Blake's full fury. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, transforming from frustrated to genuinely angry. Excuse me, did you just mock my music and my fans? The millions of people who connect with those songs about real life, real experiences, real emotions? Who the hell do you think you are? Jenna seemed to realize she had gone too far with the music comment, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her attack. I'm someone who believes that people in positions of influence should use that influence responsibly. And when they don't, they should be called out for it, regardless of how many records they've sold or how many fans they have. The philosophical difference between them was now laid bare for everyone to see. Blake believing in the power of authentic expression and connection with his audience, while Jenna seemed determined to hold him to some higher standard of social responsibility that he clearly rejected. The clash wasn't just about specific comments or actions anymore. It had become a fundamental disagreement about the role of entertainers in society. Blake's voice was shaking with barely controlled rage as he responded. You know what I find really interesting about this whole conversation? You talk about responsibility and influence, but what about your responsibility as a journalist to be fair and balanced? What about your influence on the people watching right now, who are seeing you ambush a guest who came here in good faith? The tables were turning, with Blake now putting Jenna on the defensive for her conduct during the interview. Her face flushed slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The pause was brief, but it was long enough for Blake to press his advantage. I see that look on your face, Blake continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. That's the look of someone who knows they've crossed a line, but doesn't want to admit it. You've turned what should have been a friendly conversation into an interrogation, and now you're upset that I'm not just sitting here taking it quietly. Jenna recovered quickly, her defensive instincts kicking in as she fought to regain control of the narrative. I haven't crossed any line, Blake. I've asked you direct questions about your public statements and actions. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should examine why that is, instead of attacking me for doing my job. The circular nature of their argument was becoming apparent. Each accusation met with a counter-accusation, each defensive move matched by an offensive strike. The studio audience was witnessing something unprecedented in morning television. A complete breakdown of the usual pleasantries and promotional fluff that characterized most celebrity interviews. Blake shook his head in disgust, his patience finally reaching its breaking point. Your job? Your job is supposed to be informing and entertaining your viewers, not setting up elaborate gotcha moments designed to make your guests look bad. This isn't journalism, Jenna. This is performance art. And you're using me as your unwilling co-star. The accusation that she was using him for her own purposes seemed to hit particularly close to home, and Jenna's response was swift and cutting. Nobody forced you to come on this show, Blake. Nobody made you sit in that chair. You came here because you wanted the platform, you wanted the exposure, and now you're complaining because the conversation isn't going exactly the way you planned. The suggestion that Blake was somehow complicit in his own ambush was the final straw, and his response came through gritted teeth. I came here because I thought I was dealing with professionals. I thought I was sitting down with someone who understood the difference between tough questions and character assassination. Clearly, I was wrong about that. As the confrontation reached this critical juncture, with both participants now fully engaged in what had become a deeply personal battle, the tension in the studio reached a fever pitch that suggested something dramatic was about to happen. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity as Blake and Jenna stared each other down, neither willing to back down from what had become the most explosive morning television moment in recent memory. Jenna, sensing that she had Blake on the ropes, decided to deliver what she clearly thought would be the knockout punch. Her voice took on a tone of moral superiority that was unmistakable to everyone watching. Blake, I think what's really happening here is that you're not used to being held accountable by someone who isn't intimidated by your celebrity status. You're used to friendly interviewers who just lob you softball questions about your latest projects. Well, that's not how real journalism works. The condescending nature of her comment was the final insult that Blake could tolerate. His face went from red to white with rage, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet and filled with a fury that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. Real journalism? You want to lecture me about real journalism while you're sitting there ambushing guests with gotcha questions based on manufactured controversies? Lady, you wouldn't know real journalism if it bit you on the ass. The curse word slipped out before Blake could stop himself, and while it would normally be bleeped in post-production, the live nature of the broadcast meant that millions of viewers heard it loud and clear. The studio audience gasped audibly, and crew members looked around nervously, unsure of how to handle the rapidly deteriorating situation. Jenna's eyes lit up with what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. She had gotten exactly the reaction she was looking for, and now she was ready to go in for the kill. There it is, everyone. The real Blake Shelton. Not the charming country boy persona, but the angry, entitled celebrity who can't handle being asked tough questions. This is what happens when someone challenges the narrative you've carefully constructed about yourself. Blake stood up so abruptly that his chair nearly toppled backward. His towering frame cast a shadow over Jenna as he looked down at her with undisguised contempt. The sudden movement sent a ripple of alarm through the studio, with security personnel stepping forward slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. You know what, Jenna? You're absolutely right about one thing, Blake said, his voice now carrying the authority and conviction of someone who had finally had enough. This is the real me. The real me doesn't sit quietly while some wannabe journalist tries to destroy my reputation for ratings. The real me stands up and calls out bullshit when I see it. And what I'm seeing right now is the biggest pile of bullshit I've encountered in 20 years in this business. The profanity-laced tirade sent shockwaves through the studio. This wasn't just a celebrity losing his temper. This was a complete breakdown of the carefully orchestrated world of morning television, where everything was usually sanitized and controlled. Blake had shattered that illusion completely, and there was no going back. Jenna tried to regain control of the situation, but her voice betrayed a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. Blake, please sit down. We can continue this conversation in a more constructive manner if you'll just... Constructive? Blake interrupted, his voice rising for the first time during the entire confrontation. There's nothing constructive about what you've done here today. You invited me onto your show under false pretenses, you ambushed me with accusations and innuendo, and then you have the audacity to sit there and lecture me about accountability? The only person who needs to be held accountable here is you. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Where Jenna had been in control at the beginning of the interview, Blake now commanded the room with his righteous indignation. The studio audience, many of whom were his fans, began to murmur their agreement, with some even applauding his defense of himself. Jenna's composure was cracking visibly now. The confident interviewer who had started the show was being replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate to salvage the situation. Blake, I understand you're upset, but walking away from difficult conversations isn't the answer. This is exactly the kind of dialogue that our society needs to have. Blake let out a laugh that was completely devoid of humor. Society needs to have this dialogue? What society needs is honest media coverage, not manufactured drama designed to boost ratings at the expense of people's reputations. You don't give a damn about society, Jenna. You care about creating viral moments and getting your name trending on social media. The accusation struck home, and Jenna's mask slipped completely. Her professional demeanor dissolved, replaced by something raw and defensive. How dare you question my motives? I've dedicated my career to informing the public and holding powerful people accountable. Just because you don't like the questions doesn't mean they're not legitimate. Legitimate? Blake's voice dripped with sarcasm. Show me one legitimate source for the accusations you've thrown at me today. Show me one credible piece of evidence that supports the narrative you're trying to create. You can't, because it doesn't exist. You've taken rumors, speculation, and out-of-context comments and tried to build a case against me that wouldn't hold up in a middle school debate class. The challenge hung in the air, and Jenna's silence spoke volumes. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling to come up with a response that would justify her approach to the interview. The pause stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with the studio audience and crew watching in stunned silence. Blake shook his head in disgust and began removing his microphone. This is what's wrong with media today. You don't report the news anymore. You create it. You don't inform the public. You manipulate them. And you don't hold people accountable. You tear them down for entertainment value. As he unclipped the small device from his shirt, his movements were deliberate and final. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He had made his decision, and nothing Jenna could say or do would change his mind. Blake, please. Jenna tried one last time, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. Let's finish this conversation. Our viewers deserve to hear both sides of this issue. Blake paused in his movement toward the exit and turned back to face her one final time. His expression was a mixture of disappointment and contempt that cut deeper than any angry outburst could have. Your viewers deserve better than this, Jenna. They deserve honest journalism, respectful interviews, and hosts who understand the difference between accountability and assassination. Unfortunately, they're not going to get that from you. With those words, Blake Shelton turned his back on Jenna Bush Hager and began walking toward the studio exit. His stride was confident and purposeful, the walk of a man who had stood up for himself and his principles, regardless of the consequences. The studio audience erupted in applause, many of them rising to their feet in support of the country music superstar who had refused to be bullied on national television. Jenna sat frozen in her chair, watching helplessly as her guest disappeared through the studio doors. The carefully planned interview had backfired spectacularly, and she was left to face the aftermath alone. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of her obvious discomfort and the audience's enthusiastic support for Blake's dramatic exit. As the studio doors closed behind Blake Shelton with a resounding thud, the silence that followed was deafening. The most explosive confrontation in morning television history had come to its dramatic conclusion, leaving viewers across the nation talking about what they had just witnessed. Blake had won the battle of wills, walking away with his dignity intact, while leaving Jenna to explain to her producers, her network, and her audience exactly how a simple promotional interview had turned into such a spectacular disaster. The confrontation was over, but its impact would be felt for weeks to come, as viewers debated who was right, who was wrong, and whether morning television would ever be the same again.